Hello again. My name's Paul Gilbert, and we're looking at the way compassion can help us in these times of trauma and tragedy. And today, this is talk 9, we're going to be looking at how empathy and sympathy can support compassion. And when compassion guides them, they can be very helpful to us. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen with you for a moment. Here we go. And there we go. There we go, should be there. There we are. Okay, so this is our talk for today, empathy, sympathy, and compassion for others. So just a quick reminder, as we always do, that we are layering up, looking at the layers of the mind, that the brain is made up of all of these algorithms, and these algorithms orientate what we pay attention to, and then the behaviors that are going to follow. So the one that we're interested in, of course, is the bottom one, which is the algorithm that underpins our ability to pay attention to suffering and then orientate us to do something about it and to prevent it. Now, in earlier talks, we've looked at the fact that humans are really quite different to other animals in many ways. We certainly share many of the same motivations, but we also have this new brain, which has these 3 competencies. There are more than 3, but these are your 3 basic ones for reasoning, for empathic engagement with others, understanding the minds of others, and the ability to be aware of being aware, the ability to observe one's mind, to have knowing intentionality, to do things knowingly and on purpose. And we're going to be looking at that one in talk 10. So let's have a look at this sympathy and empathy process, these competencies. Now, empathy can be defined in various ways, but generally it's about insight into the nature of the mind. And the more we understand the mind, the more insight we're going to have, and therefore the greater our capacity for empathy. Now, empathy is being described in terms of 3 core competencies, 3 core aspects, I should say, which are to do with what is called emotional contagion. And this is the ability for us to be attuned to the emotions. Now, you can see this sometimes in, say, a football match where everybody jumps up when there's a goal scored. We're all emotionally attuned to the same process, feeling the same feelings as other people. This is a form of emotional contagion. It's automatic. You don't have to do a lot of thinking. But when we do a lot of thinking, when we do try to work out the perspective of another, when we do ask ourselves, I wonder why that person is doing this or feeling that, then we're using our empathic capacity to try to understand the mind of the other, to look at the situation through their eyes, to take their perspective. What is their perspective? An understanding that people do things because they have emotions and needs and motives. And the third aspect is that we don't make the error of experiencing distress and feeling it's our distress. If we are distressed, we recognize it is the distress of the other and not ourselves. So empathy also requires us to have a differentiation and a separation and a clarity between what I am distressed about and what they are distressed about. Another important process is called sympathy. Now, unfortunately, there's quite a lot on the internet which is rather silly about sympathy, and sometimes you'll get ideas that sympathy is never of very much help. But actually, sympathy is an extremely important process because it's our reactions to distress. And they don't have to be accurate. They don't have to be empathic. They are the way that we are responding to distress. Let me give you some ideas from somebody called Nancy Eisenberg, who's one of the leading international researchers on the distinctions between sympathy and empathy. So just taking her words. And in this paper, they, as I said, they've been working for many, many years on these distinctions. They say that sympathy can be defined as a feeling of sorrow or concern for the distress or needy other, rather than feeling the same emotion as the other person is experiencing or is expected to experience. Sympathy is believed to often, but not always, stem from empathy and to predict altruistic motives and behavior. In other words, sympathy is linked to helping behavior. And we can see that sympathy has dimensions of personal distress. When we engage sympathetically with other people, we can actually, our reaction means that we can be very, very distressed by the distress in the other. And we can also project. And as a result of our projections, we can experience things that the other person is not experiencing. Now, this is very important. For example, a client has said, oh, I had to go to a funeral the other day for my father, and it was terrible. And the therapist says, oh my, that was so sad, so difficult for you. And the client says, no, not at all. I really didn't like him at all. It's just I had to pay for the funeral. So there we are. We can project and have a completely different view about what the other person is actually experiencing. This is quite important because sometimes it's a little tricky to know what is genuinely empathic connectedness and what is projection. Now, here's an example where empathy and sympathy work together. And this is a personal example I had just a couple of days ago, where Maurice Francis Coles, who was a real colleague, has done fantastic work in the area of compassion in schools. And do go and visit his website. The family advised us that unfortunately he got COVID-19 and had died. This was a tragedy. And when I heard the news, I saw the email, my first reaction was it just hit me in the stomach. It hit me in the body. And then, of course, immediately you get the big three, don't you? Which is my reactions to that news was, part of it was anger, of course. You know, this effing virus taking out wonderful people. Part of it was fear and anxiety because I'm nearly 70, and that just reminds you of my vulnerability. And I was also a little tearful and sad because he was such a enthusiastic, jovial, supportive person. So do go and check out his website and the work that he was doing. But it also inspires me to actually think, well, we must really carry on this work because what he was doing was wonderful. So personal reactions are extremely important here. I'll give you one more story, which is to do with when my father died. That was very, very distressing for me personally, but for him, he had very strong spiritual beliefs. He believed in the multidimensional universe. He believed that his consciousness would continue in a much better place. So while he was dying of cancer and was in pain, he couldn't wait to die. I mean, he was sorry to leave us, but his view of dying was he was going to be released and be in a much better place. So sympathy is very important because it's about our own emotional reactions to the distress. And for sure, it can be overwhelming. And then we talk about personal distress, which actually takes us away from the distress. But it is a very important element that we are able to acknowledge our personal reactions to distress, not just engaged in empathic, just feeling what the other person is feeling. So we need to be clear about that because, as I say, there's some rather daft things on the internet. But so when you're looking at all of these stuff, do try to make sure you're looking at good scientific data. Don't, you know, look at cartoons or whatever it is. Okay, so let's look at some dimensions of empathy then. We talked about the insight into the nature of the mind, and that also requires us then to have an insight into the nature of our minds, doesn't it? And that's the wisdoms of mind awareness, which we've been talking a lot about. And that it really requires us to keep in mind all the time that none of us chose to be here. We all here, we just became created by our genes and our backgrounds. We are all vulnerable in the same way, and we will all suffer the same fate eventually. All of us will grow old, decay, and die. We are all working the algorithms of our life. We're all programmed, right? All of us are programmed. We don't have a choice about that. What we do have a choice about is to work out those programs and then bring a compassionate orientation to them to make sure, as best we can, to live to be helpful, not harmful. So we all have emotions and motives and needs and intentions that guide us. And some of them we are aware of them and some we're not. So we know that we have unconscious processes going on as well. We all want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. So these can be a basis for common humanity of understanding that we're all part of the same species. And when we look at this, we can see that we've all just found ourselves here. We experience motives, needs, and our programming. And we're always trying to work things out as best we can. And therefore, that takes us into the area that we talked about in our last talk, that all of us can have biased attention. We can all jump to conclusions. We can all engage in better safe than sorry thinking. We can all engage in black and white thinking. We can all overgeneralize. We can all personalize, okay? Because this is what human minds do. This is what a tricky mind does. This is what happens in particular when we get into our threat system. So when we have empathy for ourselves and for others, we're starting to understand the nature of our minds, how our minds work, and the ways in which they can trick us into things, and the same for other people. So what we try to do as best we can is with mind awareness, when we have mind awareness, this is a basis for empathy, because now that we understand how minds are working, the motives and the emotions, and how they can get caught up in loops like we talked about in the last talk, and all these ways of thinking, we're now beginning to understand a little bit about the minds of other people. So that gives us insight into the minds of others, the fact that people have emotions and motives and beliefs and so forth. We can also get insight into the fact that people have needs. Some of them are recognized, some of them are not. And we can also have insights into other people's life's conditions. Now, this is extremely important to begin to recognize that other people's life's conditions can be very different to ours, and therefore we have to kind of step into those conditions. And also we need to recognize that sometimes the wisdom of compassion is the wisdom of recognizing we do not know. We don't have a good empathic connection. Maybe we're not trying to make that empathic connection. And that's very important. So this is important because this relates to the fact that actually in the world right now, nearly 1 billion people go hungry every day. So we are now in the middle of a crisis with the virus. We're in lockdown. We're doing everything we can to save lives. And yet, when we look at the figures for hunger and the children who are dying of starvation, it doesn't require a complex science. It requires political action. It's a different game, isn't it? And the reason that we're having this difficulty is because we limit our compassion to our own groups. And that's a problem we have to deal with. So compassion may not always depend on empathy, but it can also depend upon moral ideals. That actually we have to develop a moral world, a fair world, and a just world. And that also can be a driving force for why we then step into the mind of the others and try and think about the conditions of other people. We have to recognize that empathy can be bounded by groups. For example, there's been some brilliant work done by neuroscientists showing that if you put people in a scanner and they can see a friend or somebody who belongs to their group having a prick, having their needle stuck in their hand, right? Then if you're watching that and it's your friend, your brain will light up with pain pathways. But if the person is regarded as somebody you don't like, maybe from the opposite political party or even the opposite political football team, not so much. So this is a problem that with empathy, it does get bounded by groups, and therefore we have to reason and we have to step over those boundaries to recognize that we have to make effort to move into the life conditions of others. So we have to move also from empathy for a we and an us. Okay, very important that we start to have an empathic connection to us as a species, to us as a world. And not only us as a species, but to other species as well. So we are bringing the body and the mind together for self-relating, for compassion in others. So why bother? Well, why bother to do all this empathy? Why should I have to care for other people? What difference does it make? Well, the empathy and compassion have impacts on our body and our well-being. So when we're reaching out to others and when we're orientated to be helpful to others, that actually is quite good for us physiologically as well. There's quite a lot of evidence now that if we reach out to help others, this does good things to our own personal body. So it's a little bit selfish, if you like. But it also creates a safe environment around us and builds on our interconnectedness and our sharing. And that means that the world is moving forward together. And that means that what we create between ourselves are pleasant spaces to live in. Because frankly, if we go competitive, then competitive motives turn off compassion and they turn off empathy. If you're competitive, you don't want to be empathic to the other individuals that you're causing harm to. This is why it's very easy to continue with fossil fuels and so on, because why worry? We just deny climate change, okay? Because we're not empathic to the damage that we're doing. So these are very important considerations that empathy then also requires this courage, this preparedness to step into the world of the other, where perhaps our biology might want to put boundaries because we tend to be quite group focused. Developing insights into the mind of others is also called mentalization, and there's some wonderful work on the internet that you can see by people like Peter Fonagy and Alan Bateman. And again, it's this idea about trying to understand what's happening in the minds of other people. And that also includes the wisdom of not knowing, of recognizing that we don't always know. It's not easy to step into the minds of others. For example, how easy is it for men to understand what it's like to menstruate or to give birth? How easy is it for women to understand what it's like to be impotent? How easy is it for middle-class white people to understand the problems of poor black people? How easy is it for us to understand the problems of poor people that are going through lockdown? Very different experiences in the poor than in the middle classes that have got nice houses like me and gardens, right? And so the point about it is that sometimes we have to recognize that we do have, it's an act of stepping out. It's an act of stepping into the life of the other. It's not, empathy is not an automatic process necessarily, unless we choose to recognize that we have to take a effort for movement towards thinking about, considering, remembering, bringing to mind, allowing ourselves to enter into the world of the other. And when we're in interpersonal relationships, this means that we are learning to ask questions and to wonder, to take an interest in the other. If we don't take an interest in the starving of the world, why would we do anything? Why would we be bothered to become empathically engaged with the pain and suffering of starvation? So when you're working in interpersonal relationships, you're thinking about what questions might we be using. So you might ask people, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? Or you might imagine what people are feeling and thinking. What are people worrying about? What are they hoping for? What are they disappointed about? And when in interpersonal relationships with people we can interact with, these are really important questions to begin to open up a dialogue where we can understand the minds of each other. And this is important because empathy is very core for understanding pain and distress. But we can also use empathy for really doing harmful things, can't we? You know, people who are very manipulative can be very good at empathy. If you want to deceive people, you're going to have to be quite empathic, right? To be a good deceiver, okay? And you think about some of the scams that people are using on the internet. Some of what they're sending out is very, very convincing. And they could only write convincing scams if they had some degree of empathy. We also need empathy in another area, though, not just for conflict, not just for pain and distress, but also we need it in areas of disagreement and conflicts. Because it's very easy when we have a disagreement and conflict for the threat system to click in. And once the threat system clicks in, then the threat system is only interested in one of two things. Should I run away or should I fight? Fight and flight, basically. Threat system processing doesn't do a lot of empathic engagement unless it's empathic engagement to work out how to defeat your enemies or your opponents. So this is important then. And one of the things that can be really quite helpful if you want to engage in empathic training is imagine being the other for half a day. So if you're in a relationship where you've got a bit of conflict, then imagine being your partner for half a day. Or if you've got conflict with your child, imagine being your child for half a day. In other words, don't just do it for a minute here and a minute there, but really spend time, allowing yourself to spend time to live as them, to live in their mind, as it were, okay? So practicing switching your perspective from your mind to the mind of the other. And if you practice that over time, this will help to develop your empathic skills. So we've talked a lot about pain and distress. We've talked about disagreements, empathy for disagreements, and we've talked about imagining the other for half a day. We also need to be aware that we need to limit our own personal distress, because when we engage with the minds of the others, it is easy for our sympathetic reactions to become overwhelmed. When we look at the starving children in the world or some of the injustices of the world, we think, oh, you know what, it's just too difficult. So it's well known, for example, that we can be very distressed by seeing, say, a child die, but when we're focusing on, say, tens of thousands of immigrants or people fleeing Syria or whatever, we just say, oh, it's too much, it's overwhelming. So what's very important with empathy is that we actually take charge of our distress. We recognize that our distress can be overwhelming, so we pull back from that and we think, okay, what is the wise way for me to deal with this distress? Because there's a lot to it. So let me see if I can find a small step or a bite size or make a small contribution in some way to the problem, whatever that is. So rather than just be over distressed, oh, it's just too much, I can't, and then feeling bad or whatever, or trying to switch off or go into denial, the problem is too complicated, to say, yes, that's true, but what I'm going to do is take my breath, go into my compassionate self, and just think, okay, given that it's me, what can I do? There's a wonderful story about a couple walking along the beach, and there'd been a storm, and all these starfishes had been thrown up on the beach, thousands and thousands, and as they're walking along, the young lady is picking them up and throwing them back in the water, and the guy says, why are you doing that? There are thousands and thousands. And she says, because it matters to the one I throw back. So if you can only save one, then save the one. So this is very important, that we learn to tolerate our distress if we feel overwhelmed in certain situations. And therefore, that means focusing on what we call wise action. Okay, so here we are again then, running insights into the minds of others, running scenarios in our mind, learning how to ask people, learning how to collaborate. Very important too is that when people are distressed, we learn to validate their emotions. We talk about the fact that life is absolute shit for other people, isn't it? You know, it's harmful, it's hurtful, it's indifferent, it's tragic, it's traumatic. So that's the analogy. It's shit, isn't it, right? And we're also learning that we need to tolerate our own distress, but with wise engagement, because as I say, you know, sympathy, research on sympathy is showing it's very, very important, but if it becomes too distressing, then we just shut down. Now, another aspect that's really quite useful is that there have been researchers exploring how we can train in compassion. And when we do that, when we practice compassion on a regular basis for others and for self, this will alter neural responses. The way our brain responds to suffering will be changed by that. And this is the wonderful work of people like Helen Wang and Richie Davidson in Wisconsin. Now, what they did was they developed a scenario based on the Buddhist meditations called loving kindness, where they invited people to meditate for a while, to mentalize for a while, to visualize for a while, having compassion for self, for a stranger, for a difficult person. And for each target, the idea was firstly to envision suffering or imagine a time when that person was suffering or you were suffering, and then to bring attention to their reactions that were non-judgmental, so just noticing the feelings that come up in you when you think about the suffering of another or within yourself, and then cultivating compassion, where the feeling of care and concern for the other is focused on the relief of the suffering. Now, this is extremely important because when we engage in suffering, we can be overwhelmed with the first aspect, the engagement, the distress, the sympathy, and the empathic stuff, right? But always remember, the second aspect of compassion is wise action, the shifting to thinking about, so what would be the wise thing to do? What would help me deal with this? What would help me cope with this? What would help me find a small step that might be useful? And it's that shifting out of this distress into wise action that can be so important. And as I say, you know, there's quite a lot of research now showing that if we do that, or maybe that for people we care about and for ourselves, but also thinking about people we're not so keen on, this can actually help our brains in all kinds of ways. And we saw that in one of our earlier talks. So one of the things this virus has done to us is it helps us understand that humans can, in certain contexts, be incredibly empathic. They will tolerate a lot of personal distress in order to help other people. There's no doubt at all that that's going on in tens and hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and millions of people around the world are tolerating high levels of distress, high levels of fear, in order that they can be helpful to others. So we need to keep that very much in mind. But, and this is a key issue for the future, we don't want to rely on these tragedies, these serious tragedies, to bring out the best in us. So we do need to recognize that we can practice empathic engagement. We can practice thinking about the minds of the others. We can practice paying attention to the suffering of the world without becoming overwhelmed with personal distress. There are ways in which we can do this. We can focus on these abilities and train our minds. So rather than being caught up in the neoliberal competitive me, which has got us into this terrible mess we're in now, in many ways, not completely, because the virus has certainly done its bit, we can think about how we can live for others. And if there's one process that we must really learn from this, is that neoliberalism and compete is not the way our species should move off into the future. We do not want to move off into the future. If we do end up traveling to the planets, we want to take a compassionate species out there, not some of the nightmare scenarios that science fictions paint us, where we're compete all the time, and the rich are just exploiting the poor. So here we go then. When we're in meetings, when we're operating together, one of the things that we need to be doing is working out compassionate ways for disagreeing. So empathy and sympathy are guides for wise wisdoms. And if we learn to live like this, and if we develop the courage to live like this, then this virus would have been a stimulus to change the way humans react to living on this planet at this time and how we live together. And wouldn't that be amazing? See you in our next talk on mindfulness.